voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. We live, as you don't need me to tell you this, in rather odd times. A time of perhaps what the Los Angeles Times calls a failure to launch. Young people are having less sex, what we took for granted. Young people liking sex and doing more and more of it, which came out of the 1960s, seem to be less and less true. All the studies prove it. The Guardian tells us that US single people under 50 are having less sex since Roe was overturned. One wonders whether there's a connection there. The health research, doctors' research says the same thing. Americans are having less sex than ever. I'm not sure whether that means there's less intimacy, though. My guest today, Spencer Kornhaber, he's not a doctor, he's not an expert on sex, but he is a cultural expert. He writes a wonderful column on music and culture at The Atlantic, and he had a fascinating new piece out recently entitled The New Sound of Sexual Frustration. It was about Billie Eilish's new album, but it spoke, I think, generationally to a generation of teens posting songs online, a generation defined by their desires and anxieties in their headphone-encased bedroom, secluded generation. He has this wonderful phrase. He talks about a carnally confused generation, and I'm thrilled that Spencer is joining us from Brooklyn. Perhaps, Spencer, is Brooklyn the heart of our new carnally confused generation?
I think that Brooklyn hasn't quite been overrun with the generation we're talking about, but it's getting there, so it might soon be.
So I love that phrase. As I said to you when I pitched you for an interview, you should entitle your new book that. You already have a wonderful collection of essays from The Atlantic called On Divas. Might be a nice follow-up. What do you mean, Spencer, by a carnally confused generation? And how does it come out in the music, not just of Billie Eilish, but of Taylor Swift and many other artists?
Yeah, well, as you've shown with that great intro, the studies all say that young people are having less sex than their elders did at the same age. But I don't think that means that they are thinking about sex less or that they are any less exposed to desire or less in touch with what they want. It's, in fact, you can make the case that they're exposed to more sex than any generation before them. This is a generation that grew up with access to porn and that has embraced things like identifying as queer at rates that have never been seen before. So people seem to be exploring who they are, thinking about what they want more than ever, and talking about it more openly. But it clearly isn't translating into a whole lot of action. And so I've noticed in a lot of different places across popular culture, particularly in popular music, this sort of mood of longing, frustration, malaise, really. A lot of these topics that people like Billie Eilish are singing about are kind of universal and are a timeless subject for music. Popular music, rock music. So much of it has been about longing, desire, right? Like not getting what you want, can't get no satisfaction. But there's something about this moment that's coming out in the music where it feels a lot more depressive, resigned, kind of anxious. There's a real feeling of futility and even stasis in the music of someone like Billie. I'm a big fan of Billie's, and part of what's so interesting and cool about her is that she's capturing a mood that I don't think has been at the center of music for a pop star like her before. She makes me think about people, an alternative lineage of music, going back through New Wave, Depeche Mode, Nine Inch Nails, Portishead, this kind of like goth alternative tradition. But she's really made it the center of what she does. And what she does is be one of the most successful, famous, and popular people on the planet. And so I think that's all playing into that, all kind of reflects this generational moment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating generational moment. And I'm sure you didn't come up with this title for your Atlantic piece, The New Sound of Sexual Frustration. But it isn't, Spencer, would it be fair to say it's not really sexual frustration in the conventional 1950s context of which rock and roll was born, of young people, young men in particular, sitting in their bedrooms and thinking of girls, and then this explosion of rock and roll and sex in the 1960s. In an odd way, it's the end of this narrative, isn't it?
I think that's an interesting way to think about it, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the idea of the teenage musician or the young adult musician kind of growing out of their bedroom is kind of like an old and classic idea. But in this case, there's like a physical reality to it. It was not always possible to make music recordings like this of the kind of intricacy and production required from your bedroom until the past 10-20 years. Technology has made it so that someone like Billie Eilish can arise from her teenage life, hang out with her brother literally in their childhood bedroom, and post songs online for listeners who are mostly consuming them from their bedrooms online. So you have this like kind of bedroom network of creators and listeners. And I think that creates this whole different relationship with desire and frustration. It seems like people have built these kind of relationships with the people on their screens that are absolutely fanatical and obsessive, which is not a new idea, but the degree to which obsession and fanaticism is driving popular culture, celebrity culture right now, does feel new and does feel like part of what we're talking about. So there's not as much hope that those guys in the 50s and 60s had, that they would escape the bedroom and use the powers of their music to get the girl.
Yeah, they escaped. The guys in the 50s and 60s escaped the bedroom and ended up in the recording studio. But as you say, the bedroom now has become the recording studio. It's not a place where you have sex. It's a place where you live. In a way, it's replaced the office for this younger generation. What does this tell us, Spencer, of the role of place? We were promised in the digital age that place would become less important than the digital experience. But does it suggest that in an odd way, the importance of place, and in this context, the bedroom, is even more important symbolically and literally in the production of art?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you hear a lot of lyrics that explicitly reference, home environments, being cooped up, being under your sheets. I think that's a kind of basket of lyrical imagery that's really prominent in popular music right now. So that does speak to the idea that like your physical environment shapes the input to the music and the kind of the meaning of it. But I think that the internet really has delivered us into this kind of placeless, sceneless culture. I think that musicians like Billie, I mean, she's from Los Angeles, but that doesn't seem to matter at all. She's not like reflecting a local scene in any particular significant way that is legible to the people listening to the music. And I think that is part of what has created this sort of like feeling of abstraction or alienation that's in all sorts of music. It's the idea that you're so intimate with people who you have no idea where they are. I think that's a big part of what we're talking about.
Well, since we're talking music, we'll take a short musical break now, and then we'll be back with Spencer Kornhaber. I want to talk about Amy Winehouse. I want to talk about the so-called anxious generation. Lots more to talk about, so don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
Yeah, he's my fright, daring questions he won't hold back. Got me sweating under the attack. No soft spoken, he's in your face, challenging minds. No time to waste, scary dude, his words like fire. Gonna make you think, take you higher. Keen on the truth, he breaks it down. No sugarcoating, he wears the crown. He'll make you squirm, he'll make you think. Never predictable, always on the break.
We're back with Spencer Kornhaber. Spencer, do you think Billie Eilish will do a soundtrack for my show if I ask her nicely?
Yeah, I don't think she has a lot going on. So yeah, just reach out.
Well, one person who won't be able to give me a soundtrack is Amy Winehouse. She's no longer around. You wrote an interesting piece on Amy, No, 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 in response to her latest biopic, Back to Black. I saw it actually at the weekend, Spencer. I enjoyed it, but I recognize the cultural, intellectual limitations. But thinking about it now, Amy Winehouse, she died, 10 years, not much more than 10 years ago. But it seems a completely different age. Amy wasn't stuck in her bedroom. She went into studios. She had physical relationships. She seemed to enjoy sex when she could get it with her peculiar boyfriend. So has something changed dramatically since? People talk about 2012 when everything changed. How do you historicize this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about her in the context of this conversation. You know, that movie makes very clear that, yeah, she was out and about in the world, but at the end of her life, she wasn't. She was really became a shut-in and was living in her bedroom with that boyfriend for a while, hiding out from the paparazzi and doing drugs, you know, kind of fate that doesn't seem like it would have a lot to do with the younger generation, but this anxiety of being seen, of this feeling of feeling trapped, of the idea that if you go outside, you are going to be on camera, you're going to have to perform. You know, that's something that musicians, famous musicians, have made the subject of their art after they become famous for a long time. But I think in this era, there's like a new kind of relatability to that struggle. You know, Billy's last album was all about feeling trapped by fame. You know, that's kind of the entire substance of the music of Drake. Also, Taylor Swift sings about that a lot. And you think these are kind of like unrelatable messages for their listeners. But in this era, like I think a lot of people, especially younger people, feel a kinship with the plight of the celebrity because they are kind of having to do image management in their own, you know, social circles, and having to worry about, you know, making a wrong move online. You know, going from just being an anonymous person on Twitter or Instagram to doing something stupid and becoming the punchline of the internet that day. I think that's a real anxiety for people, much less being cyberbullied by people you know. I think that that anxiety is interestingly current right now. Yeah, Amy was out there in the world, and it's not to say there's not people like that are following in Amy's path. Or that you can't make comparisons with people today. You know, unfortunately, we've seen a slew of deaths and overdoses in, particularly in the world of hip hop in the past couple of years, particularly among Gen Z. And there's this impression that's being created that for people who really do go out in the world and, you know, party and do drugs and, you know, pick fights, there are real moral consequences. And we're all sitting at home online and reading these stories, especially the younger fans of these musicians. And I can't imagine it helps with their anxiety to know that, you know, their favorite rapper was, you know, died because of they were too much in the world. Yeah.
You've used the A word several times, Spencer. Anxiety. Jonathan Haidt has a best-selling, remarkably successful new book. He's caught the zeitgeist as much as Amy Winehouse did, and perhaps Billie Eilish has right now. The Anxious Generation. How is this all bound up? Haidt claims to be a social scientist. I'm somewhat suspicious, but he connects all this with the rise of mental illness and anxiety prevalence. How do you interpret it in terms of chicken and egg? What comes first? This disinterest in sex, this odd abstinence, and on the other hand, embrace of eroticism, and on the other hand, the rise of mental illness. Are they all so kind of complicatedly tangled up together that they're hard to separate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a social scientist either, but my personal feeling, my suspicion is just that we've created the greatest entertainment machine ever built and put it in the pockets of everyone, basically everyone on Earth. And that machine is so enchanting that it eats into our ability or desire to be separate from it, to be doing things that aren't focused on it. And so that will both have, maybe the chemical effect. I sort of do believe, these sort of medical theories about, dopamine fatigue. But I think even setting aside the question of the medical side of it, it's just literally a fact that there is this new force in our lives that is kind of beckoning us not to go out and go for a run, go hang out with our friends, go apply for that job. It's just, there really is a very powerful new distraction machine. And it is, you can comfort yourself by comparing it to previous innovations in entertainment. People thought that the printed book the printing press would spell the end of, all of human civilization, because people would be too bound up and excited about reading. There's this scare every generation, but the statistics and also the cultural output really does speak to the notion that something different is going on right now. And yeah, I kind of buy into a lot of this panic, honestly.
Oh, you do? So you agree?
Yeah.
I mean, Haidt also writes for The Atlantic. So you agree with the thesis in his book?
I haven't read his book. And yeah,
I don't think you have to
So,
have read
yeah.
it to know his thesis, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic idea, which I don't, I think is broadly shared. I do buy into that, the idea that phones are screwing up with, and it's not just kids' heads. I think we all feel it. I think that maybe one critique that I think is real of this panic around young people's phone use is, I think that it's, I see older people older than me who have just as disordered, if not worse, relationships with technology in their phones. That is making them, I think, anxious and scared of the world. I think that's a very real phenomenon across age brackets. But Billy sings on this album about being scared to leave the house and being in love with someone else who's scared to leave the house, and kind of recognizing this sort of mutual problem that they both have, seeing their shared damage. And I think there's a feeling that she's both like kind of allured by the fact that she relates to this person so much, but it ends up being this kind of ungulfable thing. She sings about it in the very last song, which is sort of like a dark like finale to this story that she's telling across the album of being in love with someone and then falling out of love with someone and not being able to make it work. And she really places the idea that anxiety and even agoraphobia is kind of the central problem of why they can't make it work.
Yeah, and how does this fit in with the Taylor Swift stuff? I listened, and it seemed as if her album is all about emotional pain of being left and suffering. Is that new, or is that, Spencer, you're a culture expert, especially of popular music. Is that a feature of the rock and roll canon over the last 50 years, or is it new, this obsession with hurt, personal hurt?
I think that, personal hurt, is a perennial feature of rock and roll. But I think there's something so much more specific about the way that people tend to sing about it right now. especially with Taylor Swift, where you're supposed to get ensnared with trying to figure out like literally the human being that she's singing about and what the actual details of their breakup was. Like that is part of the to maximally enjoy Taylor Swift's music means trying to actually understand what's going on in the real world that inspired that song. Whereas, people compare it to like Carly Simon, You're So Vain. The whole point of that song is that you'll never know who it's really about. So I think there's like a,
although we
she's
all kind
feeling-
of guessed, and wasn't it about Warren Beatty?
I think that is that's the prevailing theory, I believe. But for Taylor, she's harnessing our voyeurism so much more powerfully than I think really anyone has ever done before in popular music. And that voyeurism, I would theorize, probably does arise from this kind of social environment that we're talking about, where we're living so much of our lives through a screen, thinking about people that we can't actually interact with.
You mentioned, I want to take a break in a second. I was going to call you Taylor, Spencer.
I wish.
Yeah, we all wish. Spencer, you talk about people fearing being exposed by the internet and becoming, a meme. But is that paranoia? I mean, the amount of people that happens to, you have more danger of being struck by lightning. And if you are, and if it happens to you, you usually can at least wrangle a book deal out of it or find a new girl or boyfriend.
I love that perspective. I haven't thought about it that way, that we need to actually have a public awareness campaign that like how we used to, there have been public awareness campaigns to like not demonize sharks or not be so fearful of sharks that you kill them or whatever. Like maybe we need to right size people.
And we can have the Jaws music as a background, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're probably more likely to be eaten by a shark than to be canceled online. I don't know if that's actually true. We're going to have to
cancel big time. I mean, everyone's canceling everyone, but to become, I don't know, one of these 2 or 3 people a year who make the headlines because they did something incredibly stupid and it got caught by cameras. I mean, do you buy the idea, Spencer, that everyone now is a star and we're all behaving like Amy Winehouse or Keith Moon or some other crazed rock and roll star?
I don't think that everyone is. And I think that I actually think that there's like possibly something happening right now where years of kind of this scrutiny, conversations like the ones we're having are making a difference. And I think that I've sort of noticed in the past couple of years, maybe it's just coming out of the pandemic, there being like a kind of different proactive social movements, trying to tell people to get out of the house, touch grass, as the kids say. And I think that a lot of people are able to integrate these technologies into their life more or less just fine. I think that the importance of the technological shifts that we're living through and what they do to our kind of emotional experiences and culture can't be underestimated. But that's a change. That's not necessarily in all cases a bad thing. And I think trying to have that perspective that you just suggested is helpful. And I think a lot of people do have that perspective, actually.
We're speaking with Spencer Kornhaber, the author of On Divas, a collection of his columns from The Atlantic. He's also the author of a really interesting new piece in The Atlantic, The New Sound of Sexual Frustration. We get great guests like Spencer because of our friends when it comes to culture. At Liberties, a new quarterly of culture and politics, going to run a short feature on Liberties. And then we'll be back with Spencer and we'll talk more about his collection of work on divas and what makes divas so interesting to him. So we'll be back in a second. Don't go away, anyone.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Spencer Kornhaber, one of America's leading cultural critics, the author of a wonderful collection of his pieces from The Atlantic in the Atlantic editions on divas, persona, pleasure, power, the 3 Ps. Spencer, what is it about divas that make you, that have sort of in some ways inspired you to become the Atlantic's cultural critic and such an authoritative voice on new music and new themes and developments and cultures?
Well, I'd say that my interest in divas and the fact that I've written about so many of them over the years is sort of like a surprise to me still. Like I didn't, I was hired as an sort of like an assistant editor 13 years ago now at the Atlantic, editing culture pieces and then moved to writing. Um, but when I started the job, I was like an indie rock dude. I was like mostly interested in what Radiohead was going to do next. But there were that was like a moment in culture where the most interesting things that were happening started to be not the rock bands, but people like Lady Gaga, Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Lord. They were really changing the sound and the ethos of popular music in a way that was fascinating to me personally and fascinating to write about and important to comment on for the Atlantic. And so that's part of why I kind of got caught up with this beat. And the other part of it is just I think I kind of repressed my own interest in pop music. In childhood, I have these memories of really loving like sparkly dance music by people like Annie Lennox. And then feeling, kind of as I grew up that it wasn't music that boys were supposed to like. And I think that a lot of people have these go through life not realizing or maybe kind of ignoring the ways that their own ability to enjoy culture, enjoy art is shaped by what they allow themselves to enjoy. And that's based on cultural scripts. But once you come out as gay, you're allowed to do whatever you want because you've already done the scariest thing you'll ever do. So that allowed me to, kind of embrace my interest in pop music in a way that I hadn't for a lot of my early 20s and teenage years. So those two currents, I think, the kind of like the professional obligation, there's also personal side, have pushed me into writing about these people.
What do you think, or after what you called this music of a carnally confused generation, we're about to enter the AI age, the age of open AI, which seems to be shaping and reshaping everything, undermining stuff. Is this going to deepen the carnal confusion, or are we going to get to a new chapter? Are we going to have perhaps the 1960s all over again?
The hope would be for, some people talk about this need for like a new humanism or new romanticism to flourish. And I like, and that would entail people making a conscious effort to make art that centers their own humanity and advocates for the things that only human beings can do and think. I think that's happening already. I think that's what art is. And I think that the best hope we have for the arts is that that they are going to continue to capture reality and capture the reality that's being changed by things like AI in a way that will speak to audiences. That will speak to like the feelings of the culture, that will answer the questions that we all have as we live through this kind of strange next chapter. AI is not going to, I imagine, not going to be making music and art that will help us think through and contextualize our own lives in relation to it. AI imitates what humans have already done. It has not shown a great capacity for creative innovation, and it sort of seems to me antithetical to the idea of it, though maybe I don't really understand it well enough. So I think that like art will continue to have this role of helping us make sense of the world we live in and really give purpose and dignity to this time that can seem very dehumanizing and isolating. That said, that I really do fear the commercial ramifications of things like AI. I think that it seems very likely that it's going to incentivize the big institutions that kind of shape our society to invest in things that aren't people being creative and rather are just machines making junk to create background music or whatever. That's a real fear, and we should have like I think personally, I think that we need to have like a political and economic reckoning around what's about to happen. But culturally, I still have faith that humans will continue to make interesting music about the times we live in, including things like Billie Eilish making music about being horny in her bedroom or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you do a lot of listening. You're a professional listener. I think in your piece on Billie Eilish, you note that you'd listened to it many, many times. Are we close to a time, Spencer, where perhaps not so much for professional listeners like you, but for most people, we won't be able to distinguish between human created music and AI created music? Or is that boundary already so blurred that it's the wrong way of thinking of it?
I think that there's certain kinds of music and certain ways of listening to music that AI will be able to fool us about, and there's not even fool us. Like we maybe don't really care like what your if your soundtrack for the gym to get you running really fast. Do you're listening to a certain kind of music for that? Do you need it to be made by a human being? Maybe people will just decide they don't. I mean, they just need the beats, and the beats can be made by AI, and they already are. But I think there's a real strand of music. There's a lot of music that will not conceivably be replaced by AI. I don't think an AI could do what Taylor Swift is doing. What Taylor Swift is doing is so specific and human and weird and has never been done before in some ways. And it's impossible to imagine a computer doing the same thing. And it's impossible to imagine the people projecting themselves onto her in the way that they have if she was just like a digital pop star. There's this idea that we're going to have these digital pop stars, these sort of like cartoon characters. That idea has kicked around culture for a long time. And I think that maybe we're going to have a couple of them, but it seems like really again, going back to this idea of voyeurism and longing, what we long for as other people. And the best music brings us closer to feeling like we're in the room with the person who made it. And so I don't think that's going to go away.
Generationally, what we long for perhaps is youth. The Who, of course, wrote about my generation not wanting to get old. They did get old. I went to a Bruce Springsteen concert recently in San Francisco, and it was a really surreal experience of old people singing along with a 75-year-old guy about being young. How has this happened? I mean, you wrote an interesting piece about, I think you wrote it in the Atlantic, about what Joni Mitchell proved at the Grammys about her brilliant performance there. What has happened with generations and age, Spencer, that's got so surreal? You know, the Rolling Stones are still on the road, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, even Joni Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of what you're talking about is that the boomers created the culture that we live in. It's felt like for my entire life. They
did, for better or worse.
I mean, the canon that everyone's supposed to live up to are these figures like Joni and Bob and Bruce, and for good reason. I understand, the genius of what they had accomplished, and the fact that it was such a youthful explosion that resulted from particular political and economic circumstances. But time moves on, and that the generations get older, and I think there's a lot of anxiety in the culture, but it's also political and economic anxiety as well as to whether the younger generations are really keeping up in terms of creating their own canon. But I imagine that we're just living through a fairly natural process, and it will only be with a couple more years' time that we can sort of understand the canon that has come up to sort of replace the boomers. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely something else going on too with culture where things like Spotify and YouTube, just the technology streaming platforms, they allow us to consume the past, like with a kind of ease that was not always available before. And so I think there's a lot more interest and a lot more financial interest in rehashing the old or kind of repackaging things that have been done before, rediscovering old gems. And that maybe also leads to this feeling that you may be referring to of cultural stasis, or yeah, the idea that nothing ever really truly goes away. But unfortunately, one day Bruce will go away, and maybe we'll replace him with the hologram of himself. But again, the whole hologram thing, I don't really think
But isn't
scratches that
it the
itch.
longing? I mean, the people who go, who spend huge amounts of money, I have to admit, including myself, to see these old men, they're longing for something else. They don't want to see a 75-year-old man prancing around on stage. When we saw him in San Francisco, he had the absurd audacity to start prancing around in the crowd as if he was 20 years old, but he needed helpers to be able to do it, even he, because he's in remarkable shape. What is it about this generation that they're not willing to acknowledge their own age?
I mean, I think that's probably a universal aspect. You don't want to. I mean, you don't
You
like.
don't want to
I
admit to
think
being old. You're not old yet, Spencer. I don't mind. I'm old.
I mean, I certainly am in denial some days about certainly my own age. But
How old are you?
I'm 36.
No,
So,
you look a good 36.
oh,
Congratulations.
thank you, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's also part of the particular boomer mythology and the culture that the boomers created. It's that it was a youth culture and was formed by people breaking with the generation above them at a very early age in a very spectacular way, and creating all these new things. So it makes sense that particular cultural wave would be not particularly interested in evolving or embracing old age. But then again, I don't know how unique that is. There's a lot of anxiety among young people right now about aging. The Gen Z, they have these like memes about how they're aging like milk, that they feel like they're growing older faster than the people above them. Meanwhile, they're more obsessed with skincare and body modification and makeup and the filters you put on yourself when you look in the camera than any other generation before them. And they look great. They dress great. So it's this really trippy thing to hear from younger people, that they feel like they're really old already, when from everything I see, they're much better at presenting themselves than the millennials ever were. And I'm sort of in awe of their fashion sense and their ability to make their faces look shiny and stuff like that. So yeah, maybe this is an accelerating thing where having this black mirror in front of us makes us more obsessed with our appearance, which is always tied up with questions of youth.
Well, it's a great time to be a culture critic, culture observer like you. Let's end, Spencer, where we began, with sex, of course. In the LA Times piece, they quoted a young woman who talked about the reason for her not having sex. She says, I think sex is kind of gross. It seems very messy, and it's vulnerable in a way that I think would be very uncomfortable. Should we be telling a young audience who's watching this that sex is not gross? Can we encourage it?
I don't think
should we be telling them to have, I'm always telling my kids, especially my daughter, you should have sex. It's an odd thing because, the reverse is supposed to be true. It's supposed to be the parents discouraging them from having sex, but now it's the parents encouraging them.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's the problem, though, that the parents of these socially liberated generations, boomer on, are talking about sex to their kids so much that it's grossed them out. That's just a theory. But I would just say that, like, the interesting thing to me as has been watching this kind of the queerification of younger people, which does not always come with the notion that being queer is a sexual identity, that it's more of I don't think that I don't think that most people who are calling themselves queer are thinking of it as a fashion statement or anything like that, or being inauthentic. But the way that it comes, if they're not having sex, then what is it? They're like, it can come down to kind of a political positioning and a way of performing yourself in the world. Whereas in the past, the idea of queer was, you have this sexual identity that you can't really get away from, and that kind of changes how you interact with the world and leads to kind of queer aesthetics. And so, yeah, I mean, that's been very interesting to see. But I also think it's just something that with age will change. I mean, like Billie talked about how she, has loved girls all her life, but only recently realized what she actually wanted to do with a girl in like kind of graphic terms. And she's 22, and I think that's about the age where you really kind of figure that stuff out, honestly. So the fact that kids were kind of identifying as queer when they were underage and not acting on it seems healthy to me. And you know, I have some hope that over the years they will realize that it's might be icky, but it's worth it.
Well, in other words, don't worry, everyone. If you're young and you don't like sex, when you get older, it'll become more fun. Thank you so much, Spencer Kornhaber. Wonderful interview. And I'm expecting your next book to be called The Carnally Confused Generation.
All